Behold! The sword of power. Excalibur.
Welcome to lucky episode 13 of the Oh Gosh Oh Golly Oh Wow podcast, the podcast where we talk about the Marvel Comics series Excalibur and nothing but Excalibur every week for 126 plus weeks. This week we are looking at Excalibur number 13, The Marriage of True Minds, originally published in October 1989. The creative team is Chris Claremont on writing, Alan Davis on penciling, Paul Neary on inks, Glynis Oliver on colors, Tom Orzechowski on lettering, and Terry Kavanagh on editing.
Excalibur! Into the spine of the dragon! The sword! The land!
Yes, Merlin, that's it. Set the world to rights. Call the dragon. Mend the sword. Speak the charm of making.
This is the continuation of last week's story arc involving the start of the cross-time caper and Kitty Pryde becoming the object of affection of a young prince named William, who proposed to her at the end of the last issue. How will she respond? Stay tuned to find out. We've got such an exciting guest to help us hash out all the interesting gender and identity questions the story raises, who I will introduce in a moment. But first, our usual brief intros to the usual team. I am Dr. Anna Papard. I write about comics and pop culture and issues of representation for lots of your favorite academic journals and comic book websites. I'm the co-host of another podcast with a co-host of this podcast called Three Panel Contrast, and every day, in every way, I'm always on duty as Kurt Wagner's unofficial PR manager. I am joined, as always, by Mav. Take it away.
Hello, my name's Christopher Maverick, but you can call me Mav, and I am excited because the semester is over. I am an adjunct instructor at Mount Aloysius College and Duquesne University, both of which are in Pennsylvania, where I teach English and writing, and I focus on culture, literary cultural studies, and communications, and things like sexuality and gender and race representations. And I've been going crazy grading papers. That's over now. I get to spend the rest of my summer reading comic books and doing my own research and talking about stuff like the Cross-Time Caper, which is in full effect this issue. We've got finishing up the storyline from last time, where we're seeing lots of craziness with sexuality and gender, and then, just more cross-time capery goodness. I'm looking forward to the discussion today.
And Andrew, if you want to tell the listeners a little bit about yourself once again.
Hi, I'm Dr. Andrew DeMann. I am a lecturer at St. Jerome's University and a co-host of Three Panel Contrast, another podcast. And I am the project lead for the Claremont Run, which is a big Chris Claremont-oriented project with a strong social media wing to it. And I'm very excited today because our guest is someone whose work we've actually featured on the Claremont Run. So this will be either awesome or awkward, depending on how things go.
Oh, Andrew, no, it's going to be amazing. It's going to be amazing. Let me introduce her and we'll get to it. As I mentioned, we have another stupendous guest with us today in Dr. Margaret Galvan. Welcome, Margaret.
Thanks so much for having me.
Margaret is an assistant professor of visual rhetoric in the Department of English at the University of Florida. Her research examines how visual culture operates within feminist and queer social movements. Related to this, she's currently finishing a book titled Invisible Archives of the 1980s with University of Minnesota Press, which examines how publishing practices and archives have shaped understandings of the visual within feminist and queer activism. In 2021-22, she will be an external faculty fellow at the Stanford Humanities Center researching her second book about how communities of LGBTQ cartoonists innovated comics through materially engaging various grassroots formats. This all sounds so amazing. She is also the co-editor of a book about the 90s X-Men animated series, which should be coming out in 2022. We will certainly alert our listeners to that as updates emerge. I've known Margaret for a few years now in and around comic studies circles, though I'd forgotten that you had a specific interest in Kitty Pryde until Andrew did a Claremont run thread spotlighting your book chapter on Kitty from Joe Dorowski's book The Ages of the X-Men, which we will link in our show notes and we're going to talk about as well. Anyway, I wanted to find you a good Kitty issue to speak to, and hopefully this fills the bill. But before we get into our discussion, I would love, Margaret, for you to tell us a little bit more about your X-Men fandom, when you kind of started reading X-Men comics and what you made of them. Basically, if you can give our readers a sense of your X-Men origin story, as it were.
Yeah, so I actually started watching before I started reading because the X-Men animated series was, very popular in the 90s and got me hooked immediately when it first aired in 92. And I think I started reading, the first comic I picked up was in 93, and I got that from my local grocery store and, really got into the characters from there. There was also a local comic book shop where I would pick up other issues of X-Men, and that's where that and the sort of failed X-Men pilot from the 80s is where I found out about Kitty Pryde.
Pride of the X-Men, where Kitty and Kurt hug at the end, and it's adorable.
Yeah, exactly. And I really loved Kitty Pryde from the very start. I think there was something for me as a point of view character that I really related to her a bit more than Jubilee. Both characters are sort of spunky and annoying, but there was something about the way Kitty was written that was just more exciting for me. No offense to any Jubilee fans on the stream.
No, we don't want to do the Jubilee slander on this podcast, but I mean that's fair. They're very different characters. I mean, Kitty is sort of from that sort of computer tech nerd background, and that's not really Jubilee's background necessarily.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it was that they were trying to be like Jubilee is a kid of the 90s, and as like a child in the 90s, I was like, I take offense at this representation.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, but so it was, Kitty's always been sort of from the get-go a character I've really appreciated and enjoyed.
So this is your first time encountering Excalibur, though, am I correct?
Yes, definitely. I really enjoyed reading this, and you had me also read issue 12, so I got the whole sort of sense of the arc.
Like, in terms of discovering some of the older comics, like, when did you kind of decide that you wanted to write about those? Had you read those kind of growing up, or was that something you kind of revisited later?
I read some various issues. I think in the 90s they were doing like X-Men classics, and they do like reprints of some of the issues, so I was definitely aware of it. But then I thought, there was this Ages of the X-Men book, and I thought something about Kitty would be great. I had really appreciated Ramzi Fawaz's take on Jean Grey and Storm in the 70s, and so I was like, well, what about what happens after that? And so that his article was huge inspiration to the piece that I did on Kitty Pryde. And so then I was like, well, now I need to go back and read all of this, some of it for the first time, because when they would do the reprints, it's just all sort of the classic stuff.
So we will come back to some first impressions in a moment, but let's start, as we usually do, with our issue summary so that we're all on the same page. Excalibur number 13, The Marriage of True Minds, sees the team trapped in a medieval fantasy, magical, modern, mix-em-up version of London in the royal castle of the ruling queen, where Brian Braddock, aka Captain Britain, is showing off a brand new, very white costume. Kitty and Kurt tease him in adorable fashion, and we get some exposition about how Brian and Megan's powers are tied to the native magic of Britain, which explains why they got weaker, or in Megan's case, more chaotic, when the team traveled to New York. They're interrupted by the entrance of the Queen Mother, accompanied by the Princess Diana-esque Queen Consort. The Queen strongly resembles an older, and in Brian's words, kinder, version of the omniversal majestrix Saturnine, who in turn resembles Courtney Ross. There are, as we know, a lot of doppelgangers in Excalibur. The Queen discusses Prince William's marriage with Kitty. Kitty promises to let William down easy, but the Queen informs her this is not an option. A proposal from the prince cannot be refused. The argument escalates until the Queen suddenly teleports herself and Kitty elsewhere. The enraged members of Excalibur race into the castle demanding Kitty's return, but are met with a palace guard, a cadre of enormous ogres dressed in the top half of London police uniforms. Meanwhile, back in the 616, and specifically a derelict pier on Brighton Beach, the TechNet have finalized a deal with the local town council to make the pier their temporary home in exchange for improving Brighton's weather. That done, TechNet interrogates Nigel Frobisher, who is still thoroughly, literally, bent out of shape from his encounter with the TechNet in the last issue. As the TechNet watches, Nigel shifts from a gooey pile into an approximation of Courtney Ross, and then into his usual male form. Finally, Nigel is able to communicate a job offer. His boss, Courtney Ross, who, as you'll recall, is really the evil Saturn 9, wants to contract the TechNet to free Jamie Braddock, Brian Braddock's brother, who is currently being held captive somewhere in Africa, it doesn't specify, by Dr. Crocodile. This will become important in a later issue. Jumping dimensions once again, back to the royal castle, Kitty is trapped in yet another stasis tube. The queen declares Kitty's independent spirit must be tamed before she's an appropriate match for Prince William. And so they reshape Kitty, cosmetically and physically, with a series of magic spells. Kitty cries for help and Rachel answers, forcefully, along with the other members of Excalibur. But when they finally reach Kitty, the spell's been cast. She stands before them as an older, more princessy version of herself and declares she wants to marry the prince. Rachel is distraught but can't find anything amiss with Kitty's mind. She's serious about marrying William. William, though, is less sure. He preferred the previous version of Kitty. The story meanders a bit from there. Ogres repair Excalibur's train, and Kitty is attacked multiple times by the same black tentacle monster we saw in the last issue. When she's attacked, Kitty reverts to her regular form and personality. Eventually, Kurt and Megan discover Kitty's doppelganger, Catherine, is a sorceress who's trying to destroy Kitty because she is in love with William. Catherine avoids a death sentence when William decides he wants to marry her after all. The Queen agrees, though we're told in a thought bubble that she would have been perfectly content to make Kitty stay if William hadn't changed his mind. So, this issue has a lot to love. There's some really great character work, as usual, some great fantasy and humor, and a completely horrifying mind and body manipulation that is really not particularly played as horrific. I have feelings about that, but let's start with some first impressions from everybody else. Starting guest privilege with you, Margaret. Reading Excalibur and being a fan of Kitty from Uncanny X-Men, I'm curious about how you feel the character has kind of evolved in this series, or if you feel that she's evolved. Does this seem like the same version of Kitty that you were familiar with, or does she seem different at all?
She's definitely more confident, and she has the respect of her teammates, but she's still played as like punky, youthful in that sort of way. She has sort of this standout personality, but we sort of see it as a benefit rather than like something that's a detraction. And so it's sort of very much the same Kitty, but with having gained the respect and sort of being sort of a central team member is sort of how I was reading her.
Yeah, so does the character feel like older then? Like, does it feel like she's grown up a little bit, or is it just sort of like the way that the story is focusing on her, do you think?
It does feel like she's grown up a little bit. So I would be curious to know, like, what age we're sort of supposed to be sort of perceiving her as, if that's sort of clarified or not. But, they're still laying her off as sort of this youthful, like it's as if it's part of her character as well. Like, no matter that she's still older and has grown as a team member, it's sort of stuck to her as a character trait, like in a weird way.
Yeah, I think we've talked about before that, the series sort of wants to have things both ways with Kitty, because we've talked about why it actually seems to de-age her, like going from Uncanny X-Men to Excalibur, because there's no way that she could be, the series wants us to canonically think that she's 14, but that can't possibly line up age-wise. She's like 13 and a half when she joins the X-Men.
Yeah, we should post, I did a timeline just for our notes, not really for anything else, of Kitty's age via birthdays. She was aging very specifically with specific birthdays when in X-Men. So she should be 15, but spoilers moving forward, she's going to be celebrating her 15th birthday sometime from now. So she's either 14 or 15. I'm not sure they knew for sure.
Yeah. Other first impressions?
Let's see. I think the interesting thing is it's always so much about her identity and sort of her conception of herself. And so I was paying attention to, how she's sort of speaking about herself. And I like that they made her taller when they aged her. That was something I didn't pick up until I had to sort of relook at it. And I was like, oh, so it's height is a thing here. And sort of like height and thinking about stature and thinking about respect, and how people perceive people who are, taller when they can sort of see them eye to eye. There's a great panel, I'm sure that you noticed, Anna, where she's looking sort of eye to eye at Kurt, in this sort of more princess form. But then her hair is still wonky as a princess. So there's still like this inescapable spunkiness of her character, that can't be like tamed into this princess form.
Yeah, I love when Kitty has her curly hair in general in comics. I feel like that's how I think about the character. Other first impressions from you, Andrew or Mav?
One thing I would maybe talk about is my weekly Megan rant. The title is The Marriage of True Minds, which is a Shakespeare thing. It basically suggests that if you love someone, you shouldn't try to change them and you shouldn't change for them. And obviously that speaks to the theme here. But when the title page is revealed, it's Brian, who is in a relationship with an empathic metamorph who is changing to please him. And as someone who is obsessively rereading the toxicity of that relationship on my read through here. I find that really interesting, and I don't think it's intentional, but it just makes me angrier at Brian's consistent treatment of Megan.
Oh, yeah. Now I'm wondering whether it's intentional. I would be hesitant to read it as intentional as well, but yeah, it is definitely an interesting reference. Mav, any first impressions?
Similar. So first impression from 30 years ago. I love this. As I said, I'm once the Cross Time Caper starts, I was just completely on board. I loved everything about that. Rereading it through now, I have similar questions to what Andrew just did. I was aware at the time of I noticed immediately the Kitty gets taller when the spell's in effect and she goes back to being shorter, and it goes back and forth. So I had feelings on that which were weird at the time, but even weirder now, because now in comics she has aged and Kitty's just short. She's about the same height now that she was when she was 14. She's not short. She's regular woman height. She's like 5'3", or something. So it's not. It is odd for her suddenly to be Kurt height, but magic does stuff. My other first impression, which was then as well as now, and I'm sure we'll talk about it, is the very much the mind control thing that's going on, which for me was interesting, because even teenager Mav, who was not quite yet very successful scholarly Mav, who thinks deeply about these things, I was very aware that he was that Claremont as a writer was sort of playing with the idea of mind control and sexuality, and something he's aware of, because we are, for him in his life, we are 8 years removed from him trying to rehabilitate Carol Danvers from her mind control rape story that was unintentional. So I was very, trying to figure out, again, as a 15-year-old, how much intentionality is going into the meta narrative of him trying to comment on this earlier thing that he and other writers did.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, my first impression, which is, my rereading first impression, is that the first time I read this, I definitely didn't think that much about how horrifying what is done to Kitty really is. And then definitely rereading, it was sort of all I could think about, which is why I referenced it in the opening there. Because yeah, it is nothing happens here. She doesn't end up marrying William, but I mean, she still has her body and mind warped and changed, which is a thing. But I want to get into some of the implications of that for sure. But let's start with, I want to have Margaret talk a little bit more about sort of some of her research on Kitty and sort of the importance of this character in the history of comics, and particularly the history of superhero comics. To do that, I would like to talk about what Margaret has called Kitty Pryde's multivalent identity. So I'm borrowing that word multivalent from Margaret's chapter called From Kitty to Cat, Kitty Pryde and the Phases of Feminism. And as I mentioned, it's from the anthology The Ages of the X-Men. We will have that linked in our show notes. So in your chapter, Margaret, you argue that Kitty, and this is a quote, not only challenges physical structures by penetrating them with her body, but breaks down barriers between and within identities. That description really reminds me of two particularly memorable scenes from Excalibur that we talked about already: Kitty fighting her way out of the werewolf in Excalibur #2, and her stepping all the way inside Rachel's body in Excalibur #5. And we talked about the queer coding of that when we talked about that issue. But anyway, so your book chapter describes Kitty as a multivalent character who resonates with intersectional feminism, and in particular with Gloria Anzaldúa's theory of borderlands and Donna Haraway's cyborg manifesto. But that is a lot of academic ease for people who are not as familiar with some of these concepts and theorists as we might be. So would you be able to walk our listeners through like some of your central arguments from that book chapter? You already spoke a little bit about what draws you to Kitty, but what were your reasons for wanting to talk about Kitty in this way, like through these phases of feminism that you reference in your chapter?
When it comes to Kitty Pryde, right? Like when she's introduced, she's, this younger character. She's this analog for the readers, but she's also, coming of age at a time where she's sort of could benefit from the second wave of feminism, right? Like she's not on the front lines in the 70s and the late 60s. She's sort of a child of that era, right? And so I was sort of thinking about like, well, what does that mean for her in the 80s? And also how is she perhaps in conversation with in different ways of what sort of conversations in feminism that are happening that are contemporaneous to her, right? So I choose Gloria Anzaldúa and Donna Haraway because they're writing and thinking in the 80s at the same time, right? So what's in the water that people are thinking about? I also spend a bit of my work thinking about her vis-a-vis vis-a-vis John Hughes and John Hughes's films in the 80s, thinking about how she sort of echoes in some ways Molly Ringwald. She has that one sort of beautiful panel, splash page, Professor X is a jerk. And that sort of jerk is definitely a word that Molly Ringwald uses in Pretty in Pink, right? To correct her friend Ducky when he's being a jerk and sort of being mean to her. So I'm sort of thinking about her, and I do this a lot in my work, thinking about different sorts of things that are all in cultural production at the same time, right? And, thinking about this because I know also Chris Claremont had a lot of attention to and wanted to uplift his female characters. And it says something that he made his point of view character a young woman, right? And not only a young woman, but, a young woman who is also Jewish. And so, there's a lot sort of going in there, right? It's sort of intersectional before we're using that word. And so there's, ways in which she sort of echoes sort of like all of the John Hughes films, but she also, as I say in that piece, she can't really get any of those privileges, right? Because she's sort of stripped from her teen life, right? And that's sort of her struggle is sort of, and we see it here in Excalibur, in this issue of Excalibur 2, the struggle for identity and sort of trying to sort of figure out who she is and what she's meant to be. And so, we're talking about this body horror moment, but this isn't the first time it's happened. So in my article, I also talk about Days of Future Past, where she's inhabited by the future version of herself, right? From this alternate timeline, Kitty Pryde, who, say what you will about Kitty Pryde, but she's one of the only X-Men that survives in this dystopian future. But I also look a lot at Kitty Pryde and Wolverine, which is a mini-series. And in there, she's, mind controlled by a warlord, and Wolverine has to help her sort of break that mind control. It's interesting, both these moments have Wolverine sort of in the scene. So this isn't the first time this has happened to her. And it's always a moment where she's, Days of Future Past is not such a bad thing, right? It's her future self, but it's a moment of sort of redefinition or thinking about who she is, right? So that's sort of parts of what I'm thinking about in this piece, but also in connecting it to what we're here to talk about today. So I hope that's helpful.
No, it's very helpful. I mean, can you speak a little bit more how it relates to her powers, like of phasing and intangibility? Like, is that part of her multivalence for you as you see it?
Yeah, because I see her as being able to use her powers to build coalition, right, and to connect with people, bringing them from one place to the other. And so there's a way in which also, there's her power is not so powerful that she can do it all herself. She really needs to work with other people.
Yeah.
And part of the story of feminism in the 1980s is about trying to build coalition across difference, right? And so we see her also, one of the things I'm interested in my piece is how she really connects with Storm and engages with Storm in a way that's sort of more horizontal than we see with Jean Grey and Kitty Pryde. And Jean Grey, as you know, when Kitty Pryde is introduced, has died as the Phoenix. And so in some ways, Kitty Pryde is like a replacement character, although not quite. But so, the way that she's interacting with characters differently, and she has to, because of her powers, sort of be a go-between and work with, and it's all sorts of things.
We've done a lot of kind of like talking about Kitty's various sort of multiple and hybrid identities in previous episodes, sort of her ability to be flexible and sort of fill these different roles and different stories, particularly when we looked at the Inferno story where she was trapped in the movie and sort of taking on all these different roles, and how that was both like a power and a threat to her in various ways. But like, yeah, I love the idea of like her body being part of that story of multivalence. Andrew, I'm sure you have thoughts on this as well, being somebody who's talked about Kitty many times. How do you see kind of some of these themes of multivalence playing out in this particular story?
Well, I think one of the more interesting places we could go with it is just to think about how Kitty's relationship with her powers have changed in Excalibur, and how that manifests in terms of like her character arc. So the idea that she is vulnerable, the idea that her power is out of control, the idea that, I mean, as Margaret was saying, that there's a greater dependency upon others in this era. I think all of those lend themselves into kind of a broader theme of maturation and the sort of chaos and instability that goes along with that.
And like an added component of multivalence and intersectionality that she's basically, well, exactly struggling with disability right now, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure.
Mav, thoughts on any of this?
Nothing quite that smart. Um, yeah. No,
Margaret's a good
I
one.
yeah, I agree. Is basically all I could say. I've said she is my favorite X-Man at the time. It's what got me into the series because I was exactly that age, right? Like, of course I'm going to follow her. She's the character that exists in this universe just for me to follow. But that said, okay, at this point I'm 15, so I'm a 15-year-old black boy, not a 15-year-old Jewish girl. So I think that multiple, that ability to inhabit the identity for her still to be a point of view character, not for me trying, not like I'm 15, I'm a high school student. I'm not trying to, let me put on my scholarly reading cap and embody this character. I'm not doing that. I'm just sort of enjoying it because naturally I feel at that time like she is there for me to be the entry into the world, and notions of identity, how she can't be, never occur to me. So I think that speaks to the power of how well she resonates as that kind of character. And in this particular story, that's made incarnate because she's literally from panel to panel flipping back and forth between her older and her younger self. So like the multiple identity is literal in that respect. And there's an interesting line where Rachel literally says, "Oh, no, I read her mind. It's her. It's not her, but it's her." So it's expressing the very nature of, yes, one character can embody multiple parts of identity in a way in which we've spent the last 13 episodes talking about Kitty doing this all the time.
Yeah, I particularly love, I just have the picture, I have the page open where she appears to them in princess form for the first time and the characters' different reactions to her transformation. We have one of those wonderful sort of panels where Davis really does a great job with facial expressions, and Rachel is just distraught, Kurt is angry, Brian is sort of like, ooh, and Megan is just like, she looks beautiful. It's just like a wonderful little bit of character work, that one panel.
Yeah, Brian's being as creepy as ever.
Yeah. Right on brand, Brian.
Yeah.
But let's talk about that physical transformation and some of, like, I'm calling it body horror, which isn't really the right term. I think the reason I'm using that term is just because I could imagine another story in which this was played as body horror and it's really not here, which I find an interesting choice. I mean, it reminds me a little bit of kind of the wild transformations of the Silver Age of comics, particularly in DC Comics, where you would see characters take on these radically different forms. You would see like Lois Lane and Lana Lang like transform into Kryptonian insects to save the world and be very not traumatized by that experience. They would just do that and then revert to their human forms and just be like, okay, back to work tomorrow, right? And this reminds me a little bit of, that's been criticized as lacking psychological depth, and that's a fair criticism, right? One of the innovations of the Marvel comics was to have physical transformations that had psychological depth. You saw characters reckoning with what it actually means to be physically transformed in the cases of the Thing or the Hulk, which we talked about before on the podcast, or Nightcrawler a little bit later. Well, Nightcrawler's actually not a good example because he doesn't physically transform, but anyway, monster characters from that earlier era for sure. But again, here, this feels a little bit almost like a throwback in terms of the character undergoing this physical transformation and sort of not having a psychological reaction, at least that we see on the page. And again, I would suggest that there's sort of like a freedom and a danger to that, like allowing this character kind of to experience transformation and not be traumatized is a thing, but also not showing her emotional reaction is also a thing. So I was curious about your thoughts about that. And we'll start with you, Margaret. What did you feel about this approach to the transformation narrative?
Well, I think it's interesting because I think Kitty Pryde is always sort of character in flux, right? Like as a teen, right? Teens are known for trying on so many different identities. You have your goth phase, all these sort of interesting phase. I say the word phase, and her power is phasing through things.
Yeah.
But there is a moment, when because whenever in this issue, whenever she's fighting, she sort of reverts back to Kitty Pryde, right? And has an awareness that this change is happening. And at one of the last times, and one of the people I think in the castle is trying to sort of change her back, and she says, maybe Shadowcat is the person I'm meant to be, not Princess Kitty. And so it's this idea, this meant to be, right? It's not really set in stone yet. What's she to be? She's still in process, right? She's still figuring herself out, right? Because she's still, as we established earlier in this episode, she's still very much a teenager in the middle of her teen years, right? So she's not so, set in stone who she is.
Yeah, and younger characters sometimes have a freedom in terms of transformation that older characters don't, and like that explains some some of why it's presented perhaps as like less traumatizing than it would be for a different type of character. But I mean, I think what you're saying makes a lot of sense too, Margaret, that that's part of just her character as well. She's a character that's used to being in flux, so maybe that's part of it. But what did you think, Andrew or Mav, about how this was handled?
So on, I guess 4 episodes ago for the listeners, the episode where we talked about the monster and the feminine, right? There is an awareness in this issue. I mean, it's sort of an awareness by omission, but it's not as horrific as Nigel's transformation. It's not
Yeah.
as horrific as the Thing's transformation because she transforms into something beautiful, right? It is the aspect of Megan that makes her a weird character. You know, Megan's natural form is to be, well, we haven't seen her natural form yet in this book, but we know that Megan's natural form, as far as they're concerned, is this furry reptilian werewolf creature kind of thing. But she has transformed into something more appealing because that is who she is on the inside. And it's sort of okay to transform in that you become a model-esque, princess. So yay, you can transform. It's not horrific, even though it's against your will, because now you are gorgeous and elegant. And it shouldn't be that way. The story is trying to be aware of her saying, no, this is who I am. I am meant to be Shadowcat. I'm not meant to be Princess Kitty. This is her reckoning with her being her true self. It's undercut a little bit by the overall narrative because this is a point in Kitty's life where for the last year of comics and going forward, it's going to be probably another year going forward, she is going to be very obsessed with wanting to be Rachel. So there's a little bit of a, yeah, but she also does want to be this elegant woman. And it just, if they transferred her into an ogre like Shrek, then she would not be as okay with this. And so there's an awareness in the narrative of that. And it's kind of, it is kind of weird.
I guess I just wish that we'd had some of even a thought bubble, anything like her reacting to it, because we're very cut off from her thoughts in this issue, which is very strange. And I mean, that kind of makes sense in terms of having to preserve the mystery of like how much is her and how much isn't her. So I sort of understand that choice. But then one of the sort of fun, but sometimes problematic things about Cross Time Caper is that we barrel ahead on the next adventure. So we don't get a lot of sort of reflection on this experience.
No ramifications. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, she does have her thoughts, and her thoughts are being overwritten. And like, Rachel notes that she's in there, but it's a different her. Like Rachel says that. And Kurt sort of recognizes, and this is the thing that I was talking about before in sort of my first impressions. I can't read this given that it's Claremont and given knowing how much of a problem we should explain, he had with the Carol Danvers story in Avengers 200, where Carol basically shows up at Avengers Mansion pregnant in like 2 days time, has a baby, it matures to full adulthood, and then she says, oh yeah, I fell in love with him in another reality, I'm marrying him, bye. And everybody's like, yay, have fun. It's weird, it's creepy on every level.
And specifically, we should add to, like, there's a line in it that with a subtle boost from his machine, she fell in love with him. So it is explicitly against her will. So they should have picked up on that in his description.
But, well, almost incidentally though, right? Because I don't think it would, I think that story is intended to be romantic. It's awful, but it's intended to be romantic. And Claremont, who, as you know, is writing Excalibur here, was appalled by it. So a year later, he just takes over and says, I'm fixing this horrible thing that you've done. And then in Avengers Annual number 10, first appearance of Rogue, if I recall correctly.
Yep.
But he brings Ms. Marvel back. She's Captain Marvel now, same character. Carol Danvers. He brings her back and says, she freaks out. She's like, what the hell is wrong with you people? You're supposed to be my friends. You saw me get raped. You saw me go off with my abuser, and everybody was just okay with it. And they're like, we didn't know. And she says, well, you should have. The entire story, everything about this is horrible. I don't want to speak to you people ever again. And she leaves, and Carol Danvers sort of goes on to be with the X-Men as an X-Men character instead of a Avengers character for a while, because Claremont was appalled at that story. And then he works at rehabilitating her in some ways that people find questionable, some ways that's aside from the point. He's aware of that issue and he's doing it here. But the only way I can read it, which is kind of nice, is they're not willing to just go along with it. Like they're kind of, there's a lot of Kurt going, are you sure this is what you want? Are you really sure? And she says, yeah. But I don't think we're supposed to presume that they would have ever left her behind. I think that we're supposed to see this as the X-Men are a family. And I know they're Excalibur, but they're the X-Men, particularly Kurt, Rachel, and Kitty. We're a family. We're not leaving her behind. kind with this creep. Not that William's doing it on purpose, it's his grandmother, but still.
Yeah, I mean, putting my fan fiction-y brain on, I'm sort of like, there's so much behind the scenes that I'm reading into this issue in terms of, I see Kurt wanting to respect her decision because that's how he treats Kitty, but clearly being very troubled by it. I mean, he has a lot of strong facial expression reactions anyway to what's going on throughout, so we know that he's not comfortable with this.
It's 22 pages. It's one issue, but there's so much going on that I feel like resolves itself in one issue, but I feel like a lot is going on that I don't think we're wrong for reading between the lines here.
Yeah, I will say too, the other thing, the reaction that I really particularly liked was Rachel's reaction, because we get the outrage that Kitty should be feeling but isn't feeling because her mind's been overridden. We get that from Rachel. You know, she has a distraught reaction to this transformation in Kitty, and then she has the scene where she sort of turns away, sort of like sad and devastated, like she's just lost her friend, right? And it's really, really meaningful. I like really, really like that reaction from Rachel.
Well, it's a beautiful panel too where that happens, and she calls out for Rachel, and she because she feels her mental anguish, right? So she knows, you know, even though this result is, you know, she's just so, she can feel it, and probably, you know, it's in her bones, right? She knows that this is not right.
Yeah, and I think I said in a previous pod, probably the one on Excalibur #5, where we have the scene where Kitty steps completely inside Rachel, that they don't get a lot of sort of those glances that certain other queer-coded characters get. But this panel where Rachel is sort of reaching towards Kitty's face with kind of that frightened and distraught expression could qualify as one of those glances, I think. Let's talk about the Nigel transformation and how it contrasts with Kitty's transformation, because maybe that's a way of getting at it from a different angle, because there we definitely do have body horror, and we definitely do have the characters sort of experiencing horror, although I'm anticipating Andrew also speaking about some of the pleasure of that transformation in that scene, because I know it's always kind of both. But yeah, what did we make of the Nigel scene? Like, we talked a little bit about it in the last issue, but we still get a little bit more of it here that's interesting, seeing him in these between states and seeing him shift into the Courtney form, the Saturnine form, and then back into his own form. I'll let you take a stab at that one, Andrew, because I'm curious about your thoughts. Do you think that there's horror and pleasure going on in this scene?
I do, yeah. I think...
See how well I know you?
Yeah, I think there's that, again, that the fantasy of sort of erotic exhibitionism in Nigel's existence. For me, what makes it kind of really interesting is the way that Alan Davis illustrates it, because you get that like very cheesecake shot of the clothing torn just right. And you see it in Nigel's female form, and then you get like a really parallel panel 2 panels later of seeing that exact same thing framed in a physically appealing male form. So yeah, I think Claremont's definitely dipping his toe into lots of different forms of sort of erotic appeal, and Davis seems to be flanking him very well in that regard.
Yeah, they specifically are not wearing anything on their lower half. I mean, you can see that quite explicitly. There's no underwear, so I mean, it's just sort of torn clothes on the top, which I find an interesting and deliberate choice.
For sure.
Did you have any thoughts about this Nigel scene, Margaret, as somebody who's done some work of your own on embodiment?
Yeah, I mean, I reread both this issue, but also 12. So I sort of, you know, I haven't heard the podcast of what y'all talked about last week yet. You know, I'll be excited. You know, it's interesting too, because when they're transforming him, he's sort of moving between genders. You know, it's not just from one gender to the other, it's like back and forth, and they're all sort of playing with him. And yet he's relatively the sort of like played for laughs British calm about him.
Yeah.
Right. And so I was just sort of paying attention to all of this too. Like, it's horrific, but it's also sort of tamped down. But yeah, so it's a bizarre moment, right? And it's an interesting juxtaposition, right? In some ways that sort of points at perhaps the horror that's sort of more quiet in what's happening to Kitty.
Yeah, and I mean, the way that we see his body, you know, like really literally bent out of shape is so different than the transformation that we get with Kitty, where she's just in this tube and then emerges as this different person, right? We get the transformation and the in-between states, or the interstitial transformations, really played with, Margaret, as you highlighted so well. Because yeah, you're absolutely right. On the first page, he sort of gets one of his sort of male arms coming back, but then he shifts into Courtney Ross after that, right? So he's sort of in flux between these states. I guess I was sort of getting at, as an adult character who's very sure of his identity, supposedly, whatever's going on with Nigel. Yeah, but like, yeah, I mean, that's like kind of being played with.
Yeah.
Here, right? Like, but I mean, that's like maybe part of like his more horrific action. Anyway, go ahead, Mav.
Something really super important happens here that I think it's subtle, but I think it's massively. Yes, you've got the point where he's fluctuating, and there is very clear pain when he's fluctuating between Courtney and himself. So when he's switching between forms, he's horrifically in pain, like you're saying. But then when he becomes fully Courtney, there is a calmness. But the important thing is the very next thing that he says, because it's not Gatecrasher that explains what happened. Nigel explains what happened. He says, but that wasn't, it's Joy Boy's fault. Pulled the image from my dreams of my boss, Courtney Ross of Fraser's Bank. Oh Lord, if she ever finds out. So this is Nigel acknowledging how Joy Boy's powers work, not Gatecrasher acknowledging. So Nigel knows that he was Courtney because Joy Boy knows that he literally dreams of being Courtney. So it's not a surprise to him.
Yeah.
He understands, which means in all these appearances earlier that we've seen of him sexually harassing Rachel, he has a very clear understanding of his own queer desire to not just have some exhibitionistic transgender fetish, but he has a specific desire to specifically be Courtney and not be her power, but to be her as a sexual being. Like, he wants to embody that, and he's aware of it. That awareness matters.
I so am tempted to go like deep Freudian with it and be like, okay, it's Claremont writing this, and the desire to become a strong female character is like...
Maybe, but one could read that, but I don't think you can escape that for the character. Maybe you can question it for Claremont, but for the character of Nigel, I don't think you can escape it. I've
been trying to figure out why there's so much Nigel in this book for several episodes now, and I'm just like, Claremont definitely has a vested interest in this character for reasons, and I'm trying to come up with anything that we have so much of this character, because as interesting as this scene is, it's like I don't care about Nigel as a character, and I never will. But anyway, Margaret, you were gonna jump in.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not surprising to see a closeted queer or trans character trying to shame or sort of put another character in their place for their queerness, right? That's something that we see happen all the time. So it's unsurprising. It's interesting, of course, that happens among this cast of characters, right? So it's something the reader has knowledge of, but not something that Rachel has or any of the members of Excalibur have knowledge of.
Yeah, that's a good point.
They still don't really know him. I mean, all they really know about Nigel is he's this guy who irritates her from time to time. She doesn't have any formal introduction or relationship with him at all.
Can I ask everybody a question about the structure of this issue? Because as I was putting together my summary of the issue, it has kind of a meandering quality. And I feel like we get more and more of this, like throughout the Cross-Time Caper, that we have action and we have things going on, but we have kind of like quiet character moments that take up a lot of the book, and then sudden moments of action, and then back to quiet character. Like, there's not kind of traditional structure to the story in terms of, like climax, resolution, like whatever. And I was curious if that struck everybody else about this issue as well, and whether you see this as sort of a hallmark of Excalibur and something that it's doing more and more of when it gets into Cross-Time Caper. I mean, I'm arguing yes, but I was sort of interested about your thoughts about it. We haven't heard from you for a while, Andrew. Thoughts?
No, I agree with you. I think it's a trait of the Cross-Time Caper for sure. That idea of a frenetic pace in which, like, you never get a chance to, as Mav said, like reflect. You just go from adventure to adventure as fast as is humanly possible. But I do think that sort of by extension, that kind of becomes a staple of Excalibur as an issue going forward, even outside the Cross-Time Caper. So I think it's both.
Other thoughts or impressions about kind of the narrative structure here? Like, am I wrong to think it's like a little bit of a weird structure, that it's got a bit of a meandering quality?
Meandering and frantic, and bits and pieces of narratives that will not be resolved, not for the reason that a lot of Claremont narratives don't get resolved, which is just, you write something for 20 years, you try a lot of stuff, and then sooner or later you just run out of space, right? So there's a lot of stuff that just got left hanging throughout the Claremont run of X-Men and Excalibur and his Avenger stuff. But this book ends with the Queen, who we know is a Saturnine doppelganger avatar, whatever you want to call her. It ends with that moment, and she sort of has this thing where she's like, oh, of course I knew. I was controlling everything. Blah, blah, blah. Spoilers, she's on the first 3 pages of next issue, and then we'll never see her again. So it's not like she's got this moment that is like
It's a bad information dump at that last panel.
Right, but like it's an intentional one. This isn't like, oh, I'm going to hint that Nightcrawler is related to Mystique and not get back to it for 30 years. This is not that. This is him very much knowing that he is writing a plot line that he intends to do nothing with in this weird the way that the cross time caper works. Each of these worlds they jump to, because again, this is what the cross time caper is. We're going to jump from world to world to world for the next year, and each of these worlds is lived in. There is past history, there is future history. You're not going to get answers because that's how cross time capers work.
I mean, when I think about the contrast between this series and what's going on in the main X-Men series at the time, I mean, like, do we see Claremont in particular, and we always say Claremont as though he's the only person doing this book, Claremont on Davis, but the reason we often say Claremont is just because he's such an impresario of the X-Men line, and he's writing some other books as well. So, like, do we see him, like, sort of experimenting with this greater freedom here? I mean, I think about Cross Time Caper, and it's just like, man, I get to just go to another world every issue, and I don't have to deal with all of this. Like, although there is, like, the long-form storytelling in terms of the character relationships and stuff, it's so freeing to just be like, let's do a new thing every month. Like, I mean, do we sort of see that coming across?
I think we could make a musical comparison. Excalibur has a syncopated rhythm, right? The idea that, sometimes you're waiting a month for the third act. And once you do that, you're sort of signaling to the audience that you are indeed breaking from convention. And that can do really cool things in terms of altering their expectations. And again, creating a more radical pace where you don't know how long a story is going to be, or when it's going to achieve its natural resolution, or even when you're in the next story already. So I think you're really being inventive by doing this, whether it was intentional or not. I suspect it was, because when Claremont wants to do tight pacing, he actually can, and we see it in some pretty famous arcs. That's something I really enjoyed about Excalibur, and I think it's an experiment that's really just kind of coming to light in the Cross Time Caper, but it'll have dividends for a long time.
Yeah, we have a lot of things in various Cross Time Caper issues where like half of the next story will still be in this world, and then we go to the next world. So it's not even like they just go to a different world at the end of each issue. We have like a lot of overlap, and it is sort of it's a continuous story arc as much as it's a frenetic story arc as well. I want to come back to you, Margaret, in terms of, we've talked a lot on the pod, and we're talking now about some of the differences between Excalibur and some of the other X-Men books, like both historically and in the present moment, contemporary with when the series was published. As a first-time reader of Excalibur, did you notice sort of differences between this approach and sort of the approach in the X-Men books that you'd read sort of during the 80s leading up to this?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely felt a little more frenetic. It was helpful that there were these, X-Men characters or characters that recognized from the X-Men involved, right? That gave me some space to sort of figure out the other characters, which I think, it's very intentional that it's sort of put together that way, right? Bringing them into Excalibur. But, it's, once I'm in there, it's interesting, but I'd be curious to sort of see sort of how this team gels together more, and how the sort of different factions are coming together, because it still feels like a team that's like in process, right? And that they're figuring themselves out, and sort of how they're going to sort of cohere is not really clear to me, at least in what I was reading.
Yeah, that's fair, because I mean, so much of what we've been talking about in terms of the thematics of Cross Time Caper so far is, this is a team who's like finding themselves by getting lost together, that this experience of being dislocated is going to be the thing that brings them closer together.
Yeah, what are the hierarchies in the team? Like, how do we
We've talked about that.
That's a good question. Margaret, who do you think is the leader of Excalibur?
I mean, I'm sure Captain Britain thinks he's the leader.
Yeah,
okay.
That's what we've talked about. He's wrong, though.
He does believe he is the leader. That is true.
I mean, I feel like Nightcrawler is probably doing some but I feel like Kitty Pryde is like, people are all looking to her at the end of the issue. We say Shadowcat speaks for us all, but there's not like clear dynamics, right? I feel like it's in flux.
And that almost gets us back to, I've talked before about, I think that Excalibur extends in certain ways from Kurt's character in some of his previous portrayals in terms of the humor and the swashbuckling and everything. But I'm thinking more as we talk with you, Margaret, about how it extends from Kitty's character as well.
Definitely. And also, we haven't really talked yet about her doppelganger here, who I love.
We have not. Tell us about your thoughts on her doppelganger. She's a magic user, which is interesting.
Yeah, no, definitely. And she's got that spunk. Like, she's going to, I like the prettykins, and she's going to try to do away with basically herself in another form, although she doesn't realize it yet. But she's more restrained, right? She's got that princess training. Like, she's like Princess Kitty, but sort of different. And she's also a little shorter. Or maybe Kitty's hair is just a little taller. I'm not quite sure. But, it's interesting too, and we're sort of thinking about the cross-time caper structure and the fact that they leave this behind, but she stays there. So in some way, Kitty Pryde's, her another version of herself stays there. And so this is, it makes me also think of Joanna Russ's The Female Man, which years and years and years ago I wrote a undergrad honors thesis about, like, feminist women-only worlds. And that's one where 4 different versions from 4 different worlds sort of come together and talk about their different experiences of gender and identity. And it's interesting here to sort of see that sort of play out here as well, with this sort of other character in the ways that she's sort of more restrained, but also is going to do what she can to get what she wants.
I mean, did we see her as a reflection of Kitty there? I mean, Travis Smith talked a couple of episodes ago about the function of doppelgangers as mirrors for the characters that, well, for us, it's the primary version and they're a mirror of that character. So a good doppelganger story, we should see traces of that character in the doppelganger, and that helps us learn about the primary character. Do you think that's going on with Kitty and Catherine here?
I mean, a huge part of Kitty's arc and sort of storyline always, for me, I always think of this as like the person that she likes who doesn't like her back, right? And so she's got this scientist guy that she, like, but he's like besotted with someone else, right? And so we have her doppelganger here is experiencing the same thing, but it's her who is the object of affection, right? So she's actually now the arrow being pointed at, but she doesn't want it. So it's interesting sort of how it sort of spotlights these sort of interpersonal dynamics that she herself experiences, and she's able to make it work for this version of herself, right? So I think, which gives her some satisfaction.
Yeah, I mean, she's sort of having this personal experience, but then part of the personal experience maybe is that interaction with Catherine as well. Other thoughts about that Kitty-Catherine interaction? You don't have to.
I don't love the resolution. Well, okay, maybe it's an intentionality question, right? Because essentially there is a fairy tale ending where everything just sort of happens right because it's a fairy tale world, and the hell with it, right? Because Catherine did something awful, but because Kitty says, no, she's basically me, you can just be in love with her instead, just propose, it'll be all right. And that's what happens. and that's what happens. And it's just like, oh, and then again, it's fine because Queen Mother Saturnine apparently knew what she was doing all along. There's a tidiness to it that I didn't care for. It doesn't kill it for me, but I'm like, okay, I guess William gets to marry Kitty Pryde of a different universe that he didn't care about until just now.
Did we want to talk about the, like, Diana, like, sort of cameo thing and Prince William and these interconnections at all? It's going to come up in the next issue as well, but I mean, there's certainly sort of a critique of royal politics implicit here in the choice to have this sort of semi-Diana cameo, and the prince being named William as well, right? Interestingly, William and Kate foreshadowing that later marriage.
If it had been more than 4 panels worth of stuff, maybe I'd say there's criticism there, but this is rushed, and I mean, maybe it's there, like maybe that is criticism, but it's the least interesting part of this issue for me.
Yeah, he does say, wait till you've been in the family firm a while, you'll see. So using that word, the firm, but it's minor.
Yeah, well, I mean, the only thing, it comes up in some of the sort of facial expression sort of crossplay stuff where the Diana character sort of responds like to some of the things that the other female characters are doing, like sort of laughing at what they're doing and sort of having an affiliation with them just sort of subtextually, but yeah, it's not something that's sort of brought to the forefront. I was wondering if we could like close by just doing a little bit of a brief spotlight of the genius of Alan Davis. We've had a couple of Alan Davis less issues at this point in the pod, and getting back to him on fun art these last couple of issues. I think we're all feeling like a special appreciation for everything that he brings to this series. And I was wondering if in closing we could bring our visual analysis skills to a particular scene. And the one that I'm thinking about is the scene where the queen at the bottom of the page teleports Kitty and herself away. And we have the argument between the queen and Kitty going on in these long panels down the page with sort of an interplay between Megan and Rachel in the background that distracts everybody leading up to this teleportation scene. It's just such a wonderfully well done scene in terms of having the thing in the foreground and the thing in the background. Does anyone want to try to take a stab at doing like a little bit of, which works so well in an audio environment, doing a little bit of kind of a visual analysis of what's so great about this scene? We'll have it up on our website and social so we can take a look at it there.
I love this because they say nothing, but it's total characterization for Rachel. Not just because of what happened, but you have to go back the page too, to where Rachel is irritated that they're like, you're not appropriate, right? Like the entire point is, she says, some modicum of propriety of dress must be observed in ours, even by our honored guests. And Rachel says, must mean you, Meg. My outfit's far too rad. She knows, and she's irritated. So they try on the clothes, and Rachel intentionally says, no, F you, I'm going punk rocker because this is who I am. And I love that about her. Nothing ends up happening for it because the more important thing is that the queen is kidnapping Kitty, but it is exactly in pure visual rhetoric, just by Alan Davis. The side panels going down tell a story for Rachel and Megan. And the fact that Megan is, who just likes trying on clothes, is giddy to try on the outfit, and even giddier when Rachel redesigns it.
I like the way it uses kind of repetition and difference sort of heading down the page, right? Because the characters in the center of the panel, well, everybody's kind of in the same position, but we still have so much change going on, particularly down the right side. But anybody else want to take a stab at what makes this scene particularly special? Because I think there's more that we could say.
I think for me, the genius of it is when we talk about comics illustration, one of the ideals that you would create is an immersive experience for the reader in which the reader is moving around the space in a way that is synchronized with the content of the narrative, giving them this sort of spatial awareness. And exactly as you're saying, like the foreground doesn't move. It's the same. It's what's happening, in this case, in the right side of the panel that is dynamic. And you can actually see the characters turn their heads to look at it, right? So the idea is the reader becomes distracted, which is exactly what the page is trying to express, a distraction whereby you miss the sleight of hand by the queen. So you're right there in that world. And I think that's not genius illustration. That's genius draftsmanship.
Yeah.
So Davis is doing some good work there.
And also Lockheed. I mean, like, the dragon's getting distracted and he's, moving off the center of the page and I don't really notice it. I mean, because he sort of blends in and then he's like, oh shit, he's like, roar. And they're like, wait a second, dragon.
And we've brought up in the past the strangeness of Lockheed apparently being attracted to human women, which is a dynamic that we're not sure what to do with. But I mean, I gotta point out, we've talked about who's the leader of Excalibur, and we've talked about Kurt's emotional intelligence in the past. I love that he stays focused on the conversation between Kitty and the Queen and sees it going badly and is so focused on that and doesn't get distracted by what's going on the sidelines. That's a good character read of him.
And
especially in terms of, the depth of his bond with Kitty. Yes, that's like a good, well, they have a slightly different reaction because like Alistair's sort of like, hey, and like Brian is a little bit like, stop. So it's like slightly different for sure. I love what you were saying, Andrew, about the way that it brings us into the scene, like we're immersed in the distraction, and that is so dynamic in that scene.
I mean, I keep looking at every time you see something more. One thing I will say too is that, you're primed for distraction because there's so much text on the page.
Yeah,
right. It's like they're using you should generally not have that much text in a superhero comic, right? Or at least not all. It's very weighty to text, and it's all placed. The exchange, rather than having it sort of spread out amongst the panel, it's all sort of there on that left side, weighing that side down. So of course, it's sort of, visually showing us how tedious this conversation is, right?
Yeah,
and
for sure.
how open it is for people to be distracted by something else. It's like, when you're at a party and there's these two people going at it and you're like, okay, who else can I mingle with right now? How can I get myself out of this conversation?
I love that. Yeah. And just bringing up kind of the juxtaposition between image and text, right? Like, which are we going to prefer? Like this image of the ladies trying on fun outfits, or are we going to read this tedious conversation, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Any final thoughts before I want to spotlight just a very short letter in closing, but I want to give everybody a chance for final thoughts as well.
I have a silly one this time.
Sure.
It goes into our conversation about doppelgangers, but it's not so much about Kitty and her doppelganger. I find it amazing that Brian instantly recognizes an older doppelganger of Saturnine who's put on an extra 30 pounds over the years, but change her hair to brown and he's
Yeah,
lost. Like Brian dated Courtney Ross for years while he was not romantically, but while he was literally involved with Saturnine, and then it takes her dyeing her hair for him to go, oh, I never noticed you looked the same before. But like give her 20, 30 extra years and like and pounds, and you're like, oh wow, she looks just like Saturnine. Really? Like
it's intentional though, isn't it? Isn't it some sort of like commentary on Brian not being able to sort of see what's in front of him? I mean, it's like almost like, the secret identity thing of, when you fan and read into the Lois and Clark relationship, that she just can't see it because she's obsessed with this idea of this other person or something like that, right?
I prefer the reading of Lois and Clark that Lois always knows.
Yeah,
and like Clark, it's the Tom King version of him in Batman, where Superman's like, well, Catwoman can't know that I'm Superman just because she knows it's Bruce, and Lois says, of course she knows, and he's like, well, you didn't know forever, and and Lois is just like, oh honey, come on. You wore glasses. I'm the best reporter in the world. Of course I knew.
I think in closing, the last thing we're going to do, I'm going to spotlight a very short letter from the Swordstrokes letters page, and one that resonates with some of the conversations we've had on a couple of our podcasts so far when we haven't had Alan Davis penciling, and resonating with our praise of his penciling in this particular issue. So this letter is from Tim Wilkinson of Cottontown, Tennessee, and these letters are in reference to Excalibur number 8. Hi guys, we the readers of Excalibur have a subtle message for you. Where the heck is our Alan Davis in Excalibur number 8? The story is great as always, but without Alan's magical penciling skills, it just lost me. So we would really like to see him back at Excalibur number 9, okay? Because you really wouldn't want me to come down there, and, well, never mind. So I liked that, clearly the readership wasn't happy with some of these art changes as well.
Poor Ron Lim, too.
Yeah, I know. Really throwing him under the bus there. As we pointed out, he's done better work elsewhere.
I was not born to live a man's life, but to be the stuff of future memory. The fellowship was a brief beginning, a fair time that cannot be forgotten. And because it will not be forgotten, that fair time may come again.
Okay, I think we will end things there. Other than Margaret, we would like to give you another chance to plug some of your things that our listeners might be interested in. And if you would like our listeners to find you anywhere on social or whatever, you can rec that as well.
Something I'm working on with Nicholas Miller and Jeremy Carnes. We're working on an edited collection on X-Men the Animated Series. We're hoping that we'll be able to have it come out to coincide with the 30th anniversary of the series is beginning in 92, so that'd be next year. So we'll see how that goes, but either way, soon there will be a book in the world about the X-Men animated series, and I'm doing a piece in it about my sort of childhood love it's a creative piece, so I'm going to be putting some of my childhood drawings, because we made our own team called the X-Women, who are like the children in all these sort of weird mashup ways of the X-Men, and sort of thinking about sort of it as a space for girlhood, adoration, and girls feeling empowered in sort of a time of, girl power, the Riot Girl movement. So that's something I'm working on with that. There's also coming out soon is the Keywords in Comic Studies book. I think it's coming out this summer from NYU Press. I'll have a piece in there on archive, but it'll be a really great sort of introduction for people to different sorts of terms that are important within comic studies. And also for some of my other work, there's a Visual Aids, which is a really important organization supporting artists who are HIV positive. They're doing a show on comics and HIV/AIDS, and it was supposed to debut last summer, but COVID. And so it's actually going to be opening. It's going to be in New York this summer, but they've also commissioned artists to produce new comics, and those comics are available online. And I have a piece in the catalog for the exhibit on Don Melia, who is a sort of forgotten cartoonist who edited Strip AIDS, which was an important comic fundraising support for HIV/AIDS in the 80s in Britain. So that's a little bit of some stuff I'm doing, both mainstream and not. So that, I guess that's what I want to plug.
That's awesome, Margaret. Yeah, and we'll link all of that stuff on Twitter and in the show notes.
Great. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for lending us your expertise. Next, in 1 week's time, we'll be on to episode 14, in which we will be discussing Excalibur number 14, Too Many Heroes, which, as the title suggests, features many zany Marvel Universe cameos, and perhaps some real-world cameos as well. We'll have a very knowledgeable guest to help us process all that zaniness. In the meantime, if you liked what you heard, please follow us, like, and review the podcast wherever you're listening to it or watching it. Don't forget to check out our amazing YouTube videos available via our website or the Vox Popcast YouTube channel. Or if you want to chat with us about Excalibur or pitch yourself as a guest for a future episode, let us know. You could reach out via our website, goshgollywow.com, where we've got some fun extras, and via Twitter at goshgollywow, where we post daily pages from whatever issue we're reading that week, and more fun extras. Thank you, Andrew and Mav, for another splendid conversation. Thank you, Margaret, for lending us your smarts. Thank you all for listening, and a special thanks to Maximilian of Thoughtform Music for our truly epic theme song. Play us out.